For decades, the German High Command, the most respected and feared military institution in the world, studied America with meticulous care. They analyzed our journals, observed our troops during training exercises, and reached one straightforward conclusion: we were a nation of comfortable, undisciplined shopkeepers. They were convinced we were not, and could never become, true soldiers. They were catastrophically wrong. The story of precisely how they discovered their error, the specific moments that demolished their worldview, is a testament to American determination that every citizen should understand. Looking back now with historical perspective, it's tempting to call it arrogance, and perhaps it was. But in 1941, their assessment wasn't merely cynical. It was, by all European standards, perfectly logical. The German officer corps emerged from centuries of Prussian military heritage, a system that valued iron discipline, sacrifice, and a profound, almost sacred comprehension of warfare as an art form. When they looked across the Atlantic at America, they saw a nation they simply couldn't recognize from a military standpoint. They observed a people consumed with comfort, with individualism, with commercial success. A nation that hadn't experienced a major war on its own territory since the 1860s, and appeared to them to have forgotten the lessons of combat entirely. What they witnessed in our military only reinforced their prejudices. In 1941, as Hitler was launching the largest and most savage invasion in human history against the Soviet Union, the United States Army was, frankly speaking, somewhat inadequate. It comprised roughly 1.6 million men. For perspective, that was larger than Portugal's army at the time. Our tanks were frequently obsolete, thinly armored machines that would have become death traps on a European battlefield. Our officers, many of them honorable and capable men, hadn't experienced real combat since 1918, an entire generation earlier in military terms. The Germans, by contrast, were the undisputed masters of warfare. They had obliterated Poland in mere weeks. They had humiliated France, a nation with a distinguished military tradition and a substantial army, in just 6 weeks. As 1941 came to a close, their armies stood at the gates of Moscow. They had revolutionized warfare with their blitzkrieg, the lightning war doctrine. So when the news of Pearl Harbor shattered the peace on December 7th, and America was suddenly violently drawn into the global conflict, the German planners in Berlin calculated their odds. They added this new adversary to their global strategic assessment and concluded it changed virtually nothing. In their estimation, the war would conclude long before America could become a significant factor. They calculated it would require us, at minimum 2 to 3 years, to raise, train, equip, and most critically, transport a meaningful army across the vast Atlantic Ocean. By then, they reasoned, Russia would be defeated, Britain would be starved into capitulation by their U-boat campaign, and the European war would be decided. Germany would be the unchallenged master of a fortress extending from the Atlantic to the Ural Mountains. This was arguably the single most catastrophic miscalculation in modern history. The German realization that they were not confronting the America they had studied, but an entirely different and more formidable kind of enemy, didn't occur instantaneously. It arrived in a series of powerful, world-altering shocks that began not with the roar of artillery, but with the quiet scratching of a pen on paper in an intelligence office in Berlin. The initial cracks in Germany's confidence emerged from their own intelligence analysts. These were precise, professional men working in dimly lit offices, examining reports from operatives in America, studying shipping manifests, analyzing radio intercepts, and reviewing public economic data. The figures they were encountering simply couldn't be accurate. They verified their calculations repeatedly. This had to be propaganda, exaggeration, the typical American boasting they were accustomed to dismissing. They were reading intelligence reports indicating that American shipyards, facilities that had been operating at half capacity just a few years earlier, were now constructing cargo ships, the famous Liberty ships, at a pace that defied physics and all established industrial practices. They weren't merely building them in the conventional sense. They were assembling them like a child's construction toy. Men like Henry J. Kaiser, an industrialist who had never constructed a ship in his entire life, were implementing American mass production methods, welding complete hulls from massive prefabricated sections. A ship that traditionally required a European yard half a year to complete was now sliding into the water in under 2 months. Then it became 1 month. Then, in one celebrated instance, a ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, was constructed from its first keel plate to its launch in 4 days and 15 hours. The German U-boat wolf packs were sinking Allied vessels at a horrifying, unsustainable rate. It was their single greatest hope of defeating Great Britain. But the analysts in Berlin performed the new calculations, and their blood turned cold. America was already launching ships faster than the entire German U-boat fleet, at the height of its effectiveness, could possibly sink them. The critical lifeline to Britain wasn't merely holding, it was strengthening every single day. If that weren't sufficient cause for alarm, the intelligence from the skies was even more disturbing. American aircraft factories, facilities like Ford's enormous Willow Run plant in Michigan, a single factory stretching a mile in length, were producing heavy bombers as if they were Ford Model Ts. The Germans were informed that America was manufacturing more B-24 Liberator bombers in a single month than Germany's entire annual production of all heavy bombers combined. It was fantasy. It was simply inconceivable. Germany, after all, possessed the most advanced and efficient industrial economy in Europe, one that had been meticulously organized for total war since 1939. And yet these intelligence reports insisted that America, while prosecuting a two-ocean war and supplying Britain and Russia, was still outproducing the Third Reich by a factor of 3 to 4, and in some critical categories, 5 to 1. And then there were the tanks. The Germans cherished their tanks. Their panzers were their armored cavalry, masterpieces of engineering, constructed by skilled craftsmen with a kind of lethal precision. The American approach was fundamentally different. They were manufacturing M4 Sherman tanks on an automobile assembly line, treating them not as artisan weapons, but as simple, robust, replaceable instruments of war. The numbers were staggering: 10,000, 20,000. By the war's end, over 50,000 Sherman tanks. The German planners verified, and finally, with a mounting sense of dread, had to confirm the figures were legitimate. America wasn't simply building an army. It was constructing an avalanche of steel. This was unsettling. Profoundly unsettling. The mathematical implications were inescapable. War, ultimately, is a brutal equation of men and material. But the German High Command clung to one crucial conviction, a belief that had served them well for a century. Material is not everything. You can provide a shopkeeper the finest rifle in the world, but that doesn't transform him into a soldier. You can give him a tank, but it doesn't make him a tanker. The real test, the only test that truly mattered, would arrive on the battlefield. And in the dusty, sun-scorched hills of North Africa, that test was about to begin. In early 1943, it appeared for a terrifying moment that the Germans were absolutely correct. The first major engagement between German and American ground forces in the European theater was a catastrophe for the United States. At Kasserine Pass, in the rugged mountains of Tunisia, the inexperienced, untested American forces collided head-on with the hardened, battle-tested veterans of Erwin Rommel's legendary Afrika Korps. The outcome was a rout, a humiliation. The Americans were inadequately led. Their units broke and retreated, abandoning a staggering, embarrassing quantity of brand-new equipment. German soldiers examining the abandoned American tanks, artillery pieces and trucks felt their confidence soar. This was the adversary they had anticipated. Soft, awkward, poorly trained, and lacking the determination to fight. German veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had endured the frozen hell of Stalingrad and the massive grinding tank battles at Kursk, found this new enemy almost comical. The Russians were something else entirely. They were, in the German perspective, fanatics, almost inhuman in their willingness to perish. They would charge straight into machine gun fire. They accepted horrific, unimaginable casualties, and simply kept advancing, a seemingly endless tide of humanity. The Americans, by contrast, appeared overly cautious. They were, as one captured German intelligence report famously noted, lacking in fanatical determination. So the German High Command settled into a new, comfortable assumption. Yes, the Americans possessed a lot of equipment, an absurd quantity of equipment, but that equipment would be wasted by poorly trained soldiers and clumsy amateur officers. The German soldat, the professional fighting man with his superior training, his tactical excellence, and his battle-hardened courage, would easily offset the American material advantage. Quality, they believed, their entire military doctrine was founded on it, would always triumph over quantity. This assumption held, more or less through the difficult, grinding, bloody campaign up the boot of Italy. American forces were learning, certainly. They were improving, becoming tougher. They were demonstrating a disturbing, un-German-like capacity to learn from their mistakes and adapt their tactics rapidly. But the fighting was slow. It was expensive, and the Germans were masters of defensive warfare. It was, in their view, a fair fight. This comfortable belief, this final pillar of German strategic confidence, remained intact all the way until the grey, overcast morning of June 6, 1944. And in the days that followed, it wasn't just fractured, it was obliterated. The revelation of what America had become didn't happen on the beaches of Omaha, though that was a story of grim, unbelievable courage that we all know and honor. No, the real shock, the one that broke the German military mind, came in the days after the landing, as German commanders in their bunkers tried to understand what exactly they were now facing. The scale of the invasion fleet itself was a marvel. Over 5,000 ships, an armada so vast it choked the English Channel, an operation of logistical coordination that no military in history had ever even attempted, let alone pulled off. But again, scale alone could be explained by America's factories. What truly broke the German commanders, what made them realize the war was lost, was not the scale, but the philosophy. It was the systematic, almost casual, and utterly brutal application of industrial power to solve every single military problem. Let me paint you a picture of what a German commander, a veteran of France and Russia, saw in the hedgerow country of Normandy. In the European way of war, artillery was a precious, almost surgical instrument. You husbanded your shells, you fired for effect at specific high-value targets. You carefully calculated your supply, because you knew that every shell fired was one less you had for the next battle. The Americans operated under a completely different, and to the Germans, an insane set of rules. When an American infantry platoon moving through those thick, ancient hedgerows ran into a single well-hidden German machine gun nest, they didn't do what a German or Russian platoon would do. They didn't try to outflank it. They didn't launch a brave, costly frontal assault. No, the American platoon leader, a 22-year-old lieutenant who might have been selling insurance a year earlier, got on his radio. First, he would call for his own company's mortars. If that didn't silence the gun, he'd call the battalion's heavy mortars. If the machine gun was still firing, he'd get on the radio to divisional artillery. Within minutes, an entire battery of 105mm howitzers, maybe 12 guns, would unleash a furious barrage, firing more shells in 10 minutes than a German division might receive in an entire week. If the target was still a problem, the call would go out for air support, and a flight of P-47 Thunderbolts, Gerbos, as the Germans called them, would appear, loaded with 500-pound bombs and rockets. And if they were anywhere near the coast, they'd even call in naval gunfire from a battleship or a cruiser sitting offshore, firing shells the size of a small car. Shells that didn't just explode, they erased the landscape. Only after the offending hedgerow had been physically obliterated from the face of the earth, reduced to smoking firewood and craters, would the American infantry get up and cautiously advance to the next hedgerow. To the German officers watching this, it was baffling. It was bewildering. It seemed cowardly. It seemed, more than anything, wasteful. They saw it as absolute proof that the American soldier lacked the basic infantry skills, the stormtrooper spirit, the courage to close with and destroy the enemy. But they also saw, with growing horror, that it was devastatingly, undeniably effective. American forces were grinding forward, slowly, yes, but inexorably. They were taking far fewer casualties than a comparable German operation would have cost. And the German defenders, the master race of soldiers, they were being systematically annihilated, running out of ammunition, running out of men, with no replacements in sight. This was the core, fundamental difference. German logistics, a system honed to perfection by the Prussian General Staff, was based on sufficiency. You calculated the minimum supplies needed for an operation and delivered them with maximum efficiency. Waste was the ultimate sin. American logistics, by contrast, was built on abundance and redundancy. The American quartermaster's goal was not to prevent waste. His goal was to prevent any possibility, however remote, of a shortage. German intelligence officers, who captured American supply dumps, sent back reports that their superiors in Berlin literally refused to believe. They thought the officers had gone mad. They described literal mountains of ammunition crates, oceans of fuel barrels, acres of spare parts, tires, engines, crates of food, uniforms, chocolate, and cigarettes, all just sitting there, often uncovered in the rain. It seemed to violate every principle of military efficiency, but what it meant was that American units never stopped. They could operate at full intensity, 24 hours a day, indefinitely. They could afford to fire 10,000 artillery shells at a single stubborn crossroads, because it simply didn't matter. There were quite literally millions more shells on the way. But even the staggering shock of American firepower paled in comparison to another, even more profound difference. A difference that spoke to the very heart of the 20th century, and a truth that the Germans learned far too late. That difference was mechanization. The German army of 1944, the mighty Wehrmacht, the very pioneers of the Lightning War, still moved mostly on foot. It's one of the great illusions of history, one that old newsreels helped create. We see the footage of the panzer divisions, the tanks and the half-tracks, and we assume the whole army was like that. The truth is, the vast majority of the German army was a 19th century force. Their supplies, their artillery, their food, all of it was pulled by horses. Hundreds of thousands of horses. Only their elite divisions, the Panzer and Panzergrenadier units, were fully motorized, and even they were a desperate hodgepodge of captured French, Czech and Russian trucks, constantly starved for the two things an engine needs: fuel and spare parts. In all of France, the German army in the West could scrape together perhaps 2,000 operational tanks, and each one was a precious, almost irreplaceable asset. Now consider the American army that landed in Normandy. By late summer of 1944, they had deployed over 10,000 tanks, with more arriving on every single ship. But that wasn't even the real difference. The real difference was the humble truck. In the entire American army, from the division headquarters down to the rifle company, there was not a single horse, not one. Every unit was fully, 100% motorized, with standardized brand-new vehicles, the ubiquitous deuce-and-a-half truck, the Jeep, the half-track. The operational consequence of this was staggering, and it's what truly sealed Germany's fate. When a German division needed to move 100 miles to plug a gap in the line, they marched. It took them 3, maybe 4 days. They arrived at the front lines exhausted, their feet bloody, their horses spent. They needed to rest before they could even be considered combat effective. When an American division commander got an order to move 100 miles, he told his men to get in their trucks, and they drove. They arrived at the new front in 6 hours, fresh, fully supplied, and ready for combat immediately. This mobility differential meant the Americans could concentrate force faster, exploit breakthroughs with terrifying speed, and sustain an operational tempo that the German army, with its 19th century logistical tale, simply could not match. The German generals, the inheritors of Clausewitz, were playing a game of checkers, while the Americans were playing a new game entirely, a game played at the speed of the internal combustion engine. The moment this all came to a head, the day the German generals truly understood the game was over, was during Operation Cobra, in late July 1944. This was the American breakout from the confines of Normandy. It wasn't just a battle. It was an industrial process of destruction. The Americans concentrated an overwhelming force, thousands of guns, on a tiny, narrow sector of the front. Then they unleashed thousands of heavy and medium bombers to carpet bomb that sector, literally blowing the German defensive division, the elite Panzer, one of their best, off the map. It was said that men who survived were found days later, miles away, wandering in a daze, unable to speak. Then through the gap poured the armored divisions of General George S. Patton. And they didn't advance cautiously the way they had in the hedgerows. They advanced at maximum speed. They didn't stop to fight strong points. They bypassed them, leaving them for the infantry and air power to clean up later. They drove deep, 50-60 miles in a single day, into the German rear, cutting supply lines, overrunning headquarters, and shattering the entire German position in France. The German response was what they had always done. They tried to organize a counterattack, but it was hopeless. When their panzer divisions tried to assemble for their classic, brilliant tactical maneuver, American fighter bombers, directed by radio from observers on the ground, descended like hawks and tore their columns apart before they even reached the battle. When German commanders tried to coordinate a new defensive line, American signals intelligence, thanks to the code breakers at Bletchley Park and in Washington, intercepted their messages, and Allied commanders often knew their plans before their own troops did. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, the commander of German forces in France, began sending frantic, desperate reports back to Hitler in Berlin. He described a situation that was not just a defeat, but a disintegration. His forces were being systematically destroyed, not in grand, glorious battles, but by a relentless, grinding 24-hour-a-day attrition. He explained in stark, unforgiving terms that every engagement, even a local victory, resulted in a net loss for Germany. Every time his men bravely held a position, they expended irreplaceable ammunition. Every time they were forced to retreat, they had to abandon priceless equipment, tanks and artillery that they simply could not replace. Von Kluge's reports are fascinating because he insists, almost to the end, that his men are fighting well. His officers are tactically brilliant. His defenses are professional. And he was right. They were some of the best soldiers in the world. But he concluded, none of it mattered. He was facing an enemy that could simply keep attacking, keep applying pressure, keep grinding until the superior German soldier finally collapsed from sheer, utter exhaustion and depletion. The machine, the American machine, had come to collect. What followed in August of 1944 was the Great Pursuit across France. A chapter of the war that's often overlooked. This phase demonstrated American capabilities that truly seemed to violate the laws of physics as the Germans understood them. Patton's Third Army advanced hundreds of miles in just a few days, a spearhead of armor and motorized infantry that seemed to be operating completely independent of any supply lines. In reality, it was quite the opposite. This advance was sustained by the single greatest logistical achievement of the war, the Red Ball Express. With the French rail network completely destroyed by Allied bombers and the French resistance, the Allies created a massive one-way highway loop. Thousands upon thousands of trucks, driven 24 hours a day, day and night, in a never-ending convoy, often by African-American soldiers of the Quartermaster Corps, heroes who have seldom gotten their due, raced from the Normandy beaches to the front lines. They delivered thousands of tons of fuel, ammunition, and food every single day, allowing the advance to continue at a pace the Germans, with their horse-drawn wagons, could not even comprehend, let alone match. German commanders would set up what they thought was a strong defensive position along a river, like the Seine, believing it would take the Americans weeks to assemble the forces and the heavy bridging equipment to force a crossing. They would wake up the next morning to find that American combat engineers, working under fire, had already thrown a pontoon bridge across the river overnight, and that an entire American armored division was already in their rear, cutting them off. The speed, the scale, the relentless 24-hour nature of American operations, it suggested an army that had somehow conquered the basic fundamental limitations of friction, fatigue and logistics that had defined warfare for all of human history. It was around this time that German intelligence officers, desperate to understand what they were up against, began to analyze captured American field manuals, and what they found baffled them completely. And capturing thousands of prisoners. For a few frantic, freezing days, it looked like the German army of 1940 was back. But then the American difference showed itself again, and in a way that sealed Germany's fate for good. The German plan assumed the Americans would react like the French in 1940, that they would panic, that their lines would collapse, that their command structure would freeze, unsure of what to do. They were wrong. The surrounded American units, most famously the 101st Airborne at the vital crossroads town of Bastogne, were told to surrender. Their commander's reply became an American legend: nuts. They just held on. Cut off, outnumbered, freezing in foxholes with limited ammunition, they simply refused to break. And then the American logistical and mechanical beast roared to life in a move that German planners had simply not believed possible. The Americans redirected entire armies to converge on the threatened sector. General Patton's Third Army, which was 90 miles to the south, and preparing for its own offensive in a different direction, was ordered to turn 90 degrees and attack north to relieve Bastogne. His staff said it was impossible, that it would take at least a week to replan the logistics and move the troops. Patton famously told them they had 48 hours. His men got in their trucks, drove day and night on icy, treacherous roads, and smashed into the German flank, arriving with a speed that defied all European military logic. When the weather finally cleared, the skies filled with American and British aircraft. They didn't just attack the German front lines, they annihilated their supply columns. The elite German panzers, which had advanced so brilliantly, slowly, painfully ground to a halt, out of fuel. The offensive, which had cost Germany its last reserves of men, armor, and fuel, achieved nothing. And here, in the failure of the Bulge, was the final brutal lesson for the German High Command. When Germany lost those elite panzer divisions in the Ardennes, they were gone forever. The factories were bombed rubble. The fuel was gone. The experienced crews were dead or captured. The replacements simply did not exist. When America suffered heavy, grievous losses in the Ardennes, those losses were replaced within weeks. The replacement system, that vast industrial pipeline of men and materials stretching 3,000 miles back to Detroit and Pittsburgh and Los Angeles, just kept flowing. A German tactical victory might destroy an American division, but that division would be rebuilt and back in the fight a month later. An American tactical victory destroyed a German division, and that division was erased from the map permanently. It was a war of attrition, and that is a war you cannot win against an opponent who has, for all practical purposes, unlimited resources and the will to use them. In the aftermath, captured German soldiers and their letters home revealed a strange, bitter respect for their new enemy. They still believed, often to the very end, that they were the better soldiers, man for man. Their after-action reports, which we can read today, are filled with frustration. They complained bitterly about facing an enemy who refused to fight fair, an enemy that would call down a hurricane of steel and high explosives to deal with a single machine gun. They hated that the Americans seemed to have unlimited ammunition, that they ate hot meals on the front lines, and that they replaced their casualties and losses overnight. German veterans of the Eastern Front, when transferred west, made a very telling comparison. They said fighting the Russians meant facing human waves, men who could be mowed down if your defense was good and your nerve held. But fighting the Americans, they said, meant facing a machine. It meant facing a tide of firepower that would, given enough time, always reduce your position to rubble. And the Americans, it seemed, had all the time and all the ammunition in the world. What impressed and terrified the German professional officers the most was the systematic nature of it all. The Americans approached war like an industrial problem, one to be solved with efficiency and overwhelming force. They didn't rely on centuries of martial tradition. They created competent soldiers through standardized, rapid training. They didn't rely on master craftsmen to repair their tanks in the field. They used standardized parts and simply replaced what was broken. They didn't rely on the individual, swashbuckling brilliance of a few dashing officers. They relied on relentless coordination, on teamwork, on firepower, and on a system that was designed to minimize the importance of any one man. It was an army built not for extraordinary heroes, but for ordinary men, farmers, factory workers, clerks, and yes, shopkeepers to do their job effectively, day after day after day. It was a philosophy that offended the German military culture, which was built on martial virtue and individual excellence. But it was also the philosophy that was winning the war in the most decisive and crushing way imaginable. The final months of the war in Europe were a grim formality. The German army was collapsing, fielding children as young as 12 and old men in their 60s, the Volkssturm, or People's Storm, armed with single-shot Panzerfaust rockets and a desperate suicidal fanaticism. America, meanwhile, was deploying fresh, brand-new divisions equipped with the latest weapons, supported by an air force that owned the sky, and backed by a logistics system that ensured every GI was fed, armed, and supplied more lavishly than a German field marshal had been at the height of his power. The final symbolic act was the crossing of the Rhine in March 1945. The Rhine was Germany's last great natural barrier, the sacred river of German law, protecting the heartland. The Germans defended it with the desperation of a dying animal. The Americans crossed it like it was just another industrial problem to be solved. They unleashed artillery barrages on a scale that dwarfed anything seen before in the history of war, constructing massive bridges under fire with an engineering speed that seemed by European standards to be a miracle. Within days, American armies were fanning out across Western Germany against a resistance that was no longer fighting but simply dissolving. So when was the day Germany learned? America was built different. It wasn't one single day. It was a cascade of realizations, a series of painful and shocking lessons. It was the intelligence analyst in Berlin, staring at shipping numbers that couldn't possibly be real. It was the veteran quartermaster in Normandy, walking through a captured American supply dump that was the size of his entire hometown. It was the frontline commander in the hedgerows, watching his best, most hardened position get vaporized by naval gunfire from a ship he couldn't even see. And ultimately, it was the field marshal looking at the map in his bunker and realizing that the cold, hard math of attrition had already sealed his nation's fate. They learned that America had weaponized its entire economy, its very way of life, its belief in mass production, and overwhelming force. They learned that our industrial system had created a new kind of warfare, one that made their traditional centuries-old measures of skill and courage almost obsolete. They were, in the end, fighting an opponent that could afford to be wasteful, that could afford to make mistakes and replace its losses, because its resources were so truly fundamentally and unimaginably vast. It's a story from our parents' and grandparents' generation, but it's one that speaks to the unique, powerful, and sometimes terrifying character of this nation.